We are here to pick a game that had the best comeback of 2020. Anyone want to nominate some games for comeback of the year?
Oh, come on. I mean, Among Us is the obvious choice, right?
That's fair.
Because, wow, that game is a few years old. No one really seemed to give a damn about it. Suddenly, it's all anyone's talking about.
Skankcore wrote an article for us that actually showed that timeline of the comeback really well. To go from a few hundred concurrents to didn't it hit like 3 million at one point if you add mobile and PC together?
It really blew up, yeah.
So that's amazing.
It went from a game that nobody knew about to a game that a U.S. senator or a U.S. congresswoman was streaming, alongside other influencers,
bridging with other
and politicians,
with other international politicians.
Yeah, I mean, members of the Canadian Parliament have streamed Among Us.
We got Ilhan Omar's specs out of that, which is just like juicy.
She has a better PC than I do.
Yeah, Jagmeet Singh apparently has a HyperX sponsorship. Because everybody has a HyperX sponsorship. They're like, oh, man. We need to get it on this Among Us esports league.
I'm gonna nominate Flight Simulator, and I'll let Chris dig into the reasons why, but I think it better fits the definition of comeback than Among Us. To me, a comeback, especially in the context we usually use it in this industry, is you were on an upswing, and then you were on a downswing, and then you rallied back. I don't think Among Us ever really had an upswing. It was just something that relatively no one knew about and suddenly blew up, like a lot of games did this year. Whereas, as Chris will explain, Flight Simulator is this institution. It was Microsoft's, it wasn't their first game, but it's been one of I think it's their longest running. And this year it made a hell of a comeback, the connotative ending to the definition of the word.
Yeah, it's definitely true.
Krabs, do you have anything to add?
I mean, his argument was better than probably what I was going to say.
Well, I think we were talking about it offline, and you mentioned that it's kind of unique among PC gamers because, normally there's like an outcry when an anticipated game runs janky on the PC, but this year people were I like the way you put it, so if you want to jump in from there, I think your explanation would do well.
Yeah, PC gamers are pretty fickle when it comes to their performance after they've bought their $900 video cards and lovingly spent hours arranging the RGB in their case just the way they want. And for a game to come out and they try to run it at high settings and it runs at 30 FPS or below, normally there's lots of squealing and hissing and spitting. And this time it didn't really happen. For the first time I remember since around 2004, back when we had Doom 3, Half-Life 2, Far Cry, and all those kind of come out at the same time, push things forward. It looks like... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say there's sort of I agree with you because I'm the same way. Like, I'm just like the typical PC gamer. It upsets me when something doesn't run properly because, just like you said, you've invested all this. You've put, like, these PCs to run games today at the highest settings are not cheap. But when you're flying around, you're like, oh, I get it. It's the Earth in real time. That's why it doesn't run well. So there was like a legitimate reason, not just like we didn't do a good job as developers. It was like, this is the Earth. It's big and there's a lot to do here. So, and I like the way David framed it because I thought that Among Us was a slam dunk until, the way that you kind of talked about the upswing and then the downswing and then the comeback. And if you look at it that way, then I don't know that Among Us, where I kind of thought maybe it was the winner, I don't know if it is the winner.
It was never on top to come back. So, yeah.
Right. I never really thought of it that way.
But if you look at it like in the sense of a game, Among Us was losing. They had given up entirely on developing the game. And they were like, we're just going to make Among Us 2. We're going to try again. And then out of nowhere, it fucking popped off. And it basically saved the studio. They scrapped Among Us 2. And it's like gotten new life. To me, it's It is a comeback because, like,
Yeah, that's fair.
in the grand scheme of them versus the games industry, boy, were they getting their asses handed.
And so that's the thing, right? The studio, depending on what they did before that, maybe they had a comeback. I still don't think the game really qualifies, but
if you look
it's
at
a
it-
subjective argument for sure.
If you look at it from like a sports, if you're like, I'll use hockey because I'm a hockey guy. If you're down 4-0, you never were playing well in the game. But if you come back and win 5-4, that is a comeback. Like, you don't have to be winning, then losing, then winning for it to be a comeback.
Right, I agree. But usually in the context of the game industry, it's this thing was on top, and then it's really not. Like, if Quake Champions were to suddenly pop off, Quake, which is this huge thing that
Now we're just talking
bombed.
crazy.
Yeah, I know that we're talking crazy, but like Quake went from the top of the industry to like nobody even really talks about it. If Quake Champions was somehow blow up, that'd be a comeback. I think Microsoft, I mean, whatever, regardless of definition, I think Flight Simulator was definitely bigger to me because I actually think Among Us is more important in the context of games that blew up this year when everybody, quote unquote, everybody was around to watch them. And a lot of games kind of fit that definition. We can talk more about that in another category.
I disagree because Among Us popped off in July and August when half of the country had already fallen into COVID-19 fatigue. And we had already reopened. Everyone was going out to bars and the beach. It was the middle of summer, and that game popped off. It wasn't an Animal Crossing thing where everyone was stuck in their home in March and April. Like, it was July that this game popped off. I
Just
don't.
learned that I wasn't supposed to be home.
No, I'm telling you not. You can stay at home, Krabs. You should definitely stay at home. But I think framing this as Inner Sloth as the comeback of the year, which is the developer of Among Us, I'm fine with doing that. But I think it's undeniable that this is a bigger comeback than Microsoft having anything that comes back. Like, talk about resources. This company was struggling, right? You know, and this has essentially saved them. You know, this was like 3 people making a game versus God knows how many engineers behind Flight Simulator. Like, to me, this is that David versus Goliath thing. And like, Microsoft coming back is far less more impressive than 3 devs coming back, in my
Well,
opinion.
did Microsoft come back, or did they just not make a flight simulator forever?
That's
Yeah,
a comeback for
because that's
Flight
not really-
Simulator.
It's a comeback for Flight Simulator, but it's a company that had all the resources in the world
Right.
to do this.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it was a choice.
And that's why I think it's less impressive than a 3 dev team.
I'm not really going for an emotional argument here, so I can see your point, but
No, I just think just objectively, 3 people versus $1 trillion mega company. It's like, there's no way that I'm gonna be like, oh man, those New York Yankees really are the comeback of the year. Like, I would never say that. But if the Cleveland Indians actually did anything useful, I'd be like, hey, look at that. They actually did something with their pathetic payroll and like all this, you know?
Cleveland Browns, comeback of the year.
Yeah, there you go. Cleveland Browns. 8-3.
To speak to like what Bill said earlier about like, was it a comeback or did they just not make a game for a while? You want to talk about a non-emotional comeback? Nintendo, hit by the pandemic, had to sit on its laurels for such a long time, just like out with most of the tech industry, just waiting at home, and then just this last month hits 2 scenes with legal actions.
you think Nintendo was sitting at home?
Sitting at home, its legal department was. They've been pretty quiet up until this last season.
So you're saying like the Nintendo lawyers had a big comeback in 2020?
Absolutely. In the span of a week, they crushed both the Smash community and everyone that was waiting for Hyrule Warriors to come out.
Oh, that's pretty impressive.
EMCAs and cease and desists all around.
I don't think I'm gonna give an award to lawyers.
I'm just saying that's the coldest comeback of all.
They do a damn good job, though, don't they?
They were in the right, but we can talk about that in another segment probably.
I got a less stupid suggestion for comeback of the year than whatever the hell TJ just said. There's this company that makes this video game platform called Steam. They're called Valve Software.
I thought you were gonna say Stadia for a second there.
No, Valve Software, and they made a game called Half-Life Alyx. They made a Half-Life game. Half-Life came back this year.
That is a comeback by any definition. Like
That
Half-Life all but died 13 years ago,
right?
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now it's like it's roaring back because they didn't just make a Half-Life game, because that's the thing, right? They battled over a decade of expectation, and they blew all of that away.
They made a
new
Half-Life game.
concept. They made a new Half-Life
Yeah.
concept.
They did, which is
But-
kind of like Half-Life's thing, because Half-Life 1 was the game that shifted the industry away from the quote-unquote Doom clone. Half-Life 2 introduced Source and all these cool physics puzzles, and now Half-Life Alyx is like, hey, here's a real fucking VR game, you know?
Like, what do you think of when you think of VR games? You think of Beat
Tech
Saber,
demos.
and you
Yeah.
think of Half-Life. Like,
Mhm.
Half-Life has really kind of become the VR game now.
Think of Sex Bot Quality Assurance Simulator.
Exactly.
It's on my Christmas list.
I think, yeah, like, this is one of those where, like, I think Half-Life more than Valve, because I feel like Valve always had this in them.
Yeah.
The thing about the games industry is it's old enough now that a lot of people who work at these juggernaut companies like Blizzard, Valve, not Nintendo, because no Americans allowed in at NCL anyway. Is there a lot of people are there because they love those games and they want to work on those games, and I feel like there's been potential, there's been talent at Valve for years, but for whatever reason, Half-Life just didn't happen. And then if you take people who love technology and who love this franchise and wanted to just really bring it back in a big way, like this was a passion project that Valve always had in them, but I don't know that Half-Life did, because there were all these years of expectations, because the Half-Life 2 and the 2 episodes, especially episode 2, were so good. And I feel like they knew that. Like, they were smart enough to dodge that. They're like, this isn't Half-Life 3. We're going to get our feet wet by trying a new modality for Half-Life, and we're also not even going to touch the ending of Half-Life Episode 2. We're just going to take a character in Alyx that everyone loved, and we're going to create this awesome world that you want to exist in, even though it is dystopic as fuck. It's a really interesting and fantastic comeback, I think.
I think what's cool about it is that Valve took 2 studios and combined them for this effort. You have the devs behind the lab, which honestly, before Alyx, when I thought about cool VR demos, the lab was one of them. It's still one of the more impressive VR demos, and it was free and it came with Vive at launch or whatever. And then they took Campo Santo, who are known for Firewatch and these really excellent storytellers and world builders, and they combined those 2 things, and it's like super magical what we got out of that. And it's just, after Artifact, this is a big deal to me that, like, yes, even Valve can ship a stinker like Artifact, but then against like Gabe's wishes, most likely they actually released another game. Like, because every interview I've heard with Gabe Newell, the guy just thinks they should be focused on Dota 2. Like, he doesn't think working on any other game makes sense because they're a Dota 2 company. Dota 2 is the most important game in the world to him. So, like, the fact that after Artifact, that they could do anything at that company is amazing to me. And that this is what we got is outstanding.
Which is ironic, because for Bet on Black, my long read on Microsoft and Xbox, I actually interviewed Mike Harrington, the co-founder of Valve, and he said that he and Gabe actually went to Microsoft with Half-Life first, and Ed Freeze said, no, this is too different than Doom, which is the hot thing right now. So Valve, like, Gabe's at a point where he wanted to change things up, and now he kind of just wants to be complacent, you know? So the fact that this, that a lot of his talent can make this happen is a pretty cool thing.
Well,
Yeah, and
I do want to bring up
Yeah,
two
go for it.
things from the news stories I've been doing on Half-Life Alyx this year. One of the things was back when they were doing when they were doing marketing for Half-Life Alyx, and they did a Q&A. And the main part of this, and this was something I thought of for years, you can't just make a Half-Life 3 because everyone's expectations are so high that it has a chance of failing regardless of how good it is. And that was a sentiment at Valve too. In that QA, they were one of their lead designers revealed we couldn't just make Half-Life again.
Mhm.
It had to be, technology had to be different, and the concepts had to be different enough that it would make sense to move the industry it would make sense in a way that moves the industry forward. And that is something that Half-Life Alyx arguably does quite well as far as VR goes, because yes, VR games have typically been short experiences, and we're seeing a change in that. Saints and Sinners is, I would argue, a full game, but Half-Life Alyx is head and shoulders above anything we've seen before in the VR space. And then there's the fact that this is to speak to your point, David, earlier about this is a multi-generational thing. When they released the director's commentary or developer's commentary recently, one of the things they brought up was they had developers in there that were grew up watching the developer's commentary for Half-Life.
Yeah.
That we're now working on this game beside the old guard, and it's just crazy to see the amount of time that has passed to where kids that grew up with this stuff are now working alongside the veterans to make their own developer commentary in a new Half-Life game. That's just crazy.
And it's also it's pretty heartwarming, even though this is all capitalist stuff, but to get to be a part of this is a dream come true. There's a point in time I wanted to work at Blizzard so that I could make Diablo games. And now people are able to do that. When you're this established company, you can have this multi-generational effect, especially with Valve's hierarchy. This was revealed 10 years ago or so, where it's very ad hoc, where you can just kind of walk around and say, hey, do you want to make this game, and cook up a prototype. But it's really hard, I would imagine, to say, hey, you want to make a new Half-Life? Because there's all this expectation, like you said. And so, I think they went about this in exactly the right way.
I think the issue is, I don't want to downplay how how noteworthy a new Half-Life game is, but it's a VR experience, which means there's a gateway to entry now for it, which I think presents a problem for a lot of gamers.
I see, but independent of that, objectively, this is a huge comeback for the franchise. You know what I mean?
Agreed, but I mean, it could also be argued that you make a new just FPS game, and you remove the VR equation from it, all of a sudden it's a much bigger deal.
Well, TJ and I covered that. TJ and I covered that. They couldn't just do another Half-Life game.
That's just flat out wrong. Is that concept that you can make a flat screen Half-Life experience and it would be as important as Alyx is just wrong. What they did here, to David's point about Half-Life 2, when that came out, it said, here's Source. Here's what we can do with Source. Here's these crazy physics puzzles that have never existed. That's
every
what
Half-Life. Every Half-Life game has not only been a new game, but it has moved the industry forward.
Yeah, it's genre defining.
Mm-hmm.
And so is Alyx. Alyx is the case for VR. Alyx is the case. This is why it had to be a VR game. Because they came up with something that you couldn't do without an HMD.
It's also,
you literally can't do it.
I think it meets the definition of system seller. I know people who are like, oh shit, not only is this a new Half-Life, but it's great. I am going to go buy whatever VR set is compatible, even the lower price ones. And again, that's something Valve does very well. Their hardware is scalable. Their software, their engines are scalable, so that I can play this. You can play it on a Quest 2 all the way up to the Valve Index, which is way up this year. because of Half-Life
Yeah.
Alex.
I can say that I've never had an interest in getting a VR headset, and this is the first time that I've ever actually been like very, very close to being like, okay, now is the time. Like I've been waiting for something because I kind of thought like VR felt gimmicky to me personally for a long time, and this is the first time I was like, oh, okay, now we're starting to get somewhere.
Same.
To Blake's point, though, if they release Half-Life Schmalix and it's on Schmexbox or whatever, what is it gonna do that's any different than COD has done, Doom Eternal has done? The FPS genre is pretty damn flushed out at this point.
That's the key right there, Asif. If they released Half-Life 3 and it was just another FPS shooter, it would be the Doom Eternal to Doom 2016. It would be good, probably, but not nearly as impactful.
Not revolutionary, not genre defining, not like here's the reason VR exists. Like that's what I think so transformative about it, is that there is a level of detail, and also I think it's accentuated by the hand presence that's given by the knuckle controllers, specifically in the Valve Index experience, that you've never had in a VR game. Like the level of detail that they've put into the level design, interactivity with objects,
or in a game, period. Like the interactivity jumps across from just VR to like, wow, this is what video games could be.
But when you port, and it already happens, there's a mod for flat screen Half-Life Alyx, it doesn't translate. It just doesn't, because you have to be immersed for it to actually feel cool. It actually feels wonky or weird when you're looking at it in a flat screen environment. And like, I just think it's going to be the challenge of anyone who's voting for Half-Life Alyx for Game of the Year, to try to convince people who haven't played it how different it feels to be in that thing. So now, I know we're not talking about best VR, we're not talking about Game of the Year here, we're talking about comeback. Half-Life the series, I think, had a comeback this year. I think that's undeniable. It's a question of which of these comebacks is bigger, right?
I mean, if we're talking about which comeback had the biggest impact on the year and gaming this year, I would still stick with Among Us.
I would
personally
say Animal Crossing, but not a comeback, just because that really set the trend for
this isn't most
interaction.
impactful. This is best comeback. So it's a question of what's the most epic comeback here.
Yeah, I think a small game going huge so quickly is definitely a big comeback. Yeah.
So we can put this. Let's put this to a vote. Does anyone else have any other nominations?
I'll kick it off. God, this was going to be the Among Us Runaway category, but crap.
There's other categories that Among Us is going to win.
For the industry, for gaming, and for our audience that has been waiting for Half-Life for so long, I have to say Half-Life.
I'll give a second vote to Half-Life.
I'll third Half-Life.
Oh snap! What's happening, you guys?
Valve makes games. Half-Life.
Valve making a game is pretty damn impressive.
But is it a comeback though? Like they've
We
always,
just-
We're beyond the
Yes,
qualifier
Greg,
zone.
it is.
Yeah.
I just spent 10 minutes.
We spent like
I know, but,
20
I
minutes going over why it's a comeback.
I get that, but like at the same time, I still.
If it had been 14
you're
years
trying
since
to
the
sell me
last one
something, I'm
instead of
not
13,
buying
would that
it.
be qualifying?
Seriously, how many years did
How many years did it need to not happen between before?
Yeah, I'm curious, Greg. Was it 20 years for it to be a comeback?
But we're talking about like Valve as a company, right?
No,
like,
we're
they've
talking
done
about
other
Half-Life.
shit, just
No,
not
the
Half-Life.
nomination is
Like, you know what I mean? Like
The nomination is Half-Life, not Valve.
Yeah, we're talking about the Half-Life series, which has been one of the biggest memes in gaming history for how long now? Like, oh, Half-Life 3 win. You know, Valve doesn't make games. Like
Valve
been
can't count to
the
three.
thing.
Well, they still can't, but
Yeah, Valve doesn't make games. Like my vote has to go to Half-Life Alyx. As much as Among Us is really cool, it's great. Like Half-Life coming back in the way that it did, and being as defining as the original was in a whole new way is huge. It's huge. So
nice. Steve, do you got a vote for me?
I'm going with Among Us.
Among Us.
Yeah.
Okay. Nick?
What? Yeah, I'm going with Among Us, man. I mean,
Yes. Okay.
like it's great that Half-Life Alyx came back, but I feel like the VR thing is like a thing for me, honestly. So yeah,
Okay.
I'm going with Among Us.
Donovan?
I'm going with Among Us as well. We're talking about a game that had 8 concurrent players almost a year after it came out, then went on to cross 1 million. That's my comeback of the
Bill?
year.
You know what? Also for VR reasons, but in a completely different light, I'm going to go with Half-Life because I actually am taking into account the impact on the industry of the comeback.
Greg?
Not so much the size.
Among Us.
Among Us. Sam?
I'm gonna have to go with Among Us because in my mind, Half-Life was never at a loss. Like it just wasn't here. It is a comeback in some regards, but I think that Among Us was lifting off and getting popular, and then it just disappeared for 2 years.
Half-Life 2 made Steam a thing, and then it went moribund. You know what I mean? But I mean, I'm not arguing with your vote. Your vote is your vote, but this franchise, it changed FPS, and then the second, the sequel changed the way we buy games and
Sam is
play
racist
games.
against Half-Life because he was a Halo 2 guy in 2004. You can't talk sense to these people. They're all sick.
Well, it looks like I am the deciding vote here.
I'm not dissenting with you, Sam. I just you mentioned Half-Life, and I thought I would give a little more context to it as well.
Well, it sounds like Half-Life is gonna take it home then.
I mean, I think the 3 games that we mentioned all had amazing stories this year. I think Half-Life is the biggest, so I'm gonna vote for Half-Life. Half-Life, the series, gets the Shacknews best comeback of 2020. Barely.